Hi, everyone, and welcome to Subsistence Crop, a podcast cultivated by the Cannabis Studies Lab at Cal Poly Humboldt, where we talk about human cannabis relationships beyond commerce and prohibition. Hey guys, welcome to Subsistence Crop Student Talk Cannabis. We are here with Dr. Dominic Corva, and just a question to get the conversation rolling. I got a question for you, Dominic. Just what exactly is a Schedule I drug? What does that mean?
A Schedule I drug is a drug that has been placed in the Controlled Substances Act, which is passed in 1970 by the federal government. And this was a way to categorize different drugs and drug plants according to their usefulness or perceived usefulness to society or danger to society. So it's actually more than just simply like, okay, Schedule I is no medical use, no good, nobody do this, don't touch this, we're done. And cannabis was placed in that one. And of course, there are other drugs like cocaine was Schedule II, for example, that you kind of think about, doesn't quite make sense. So the schedule, though, doesn't just kind of ban drugs, it also regulates them. Right, so the drugs that are in the other schedules get to be pharmaceutical drugs, and there are different levels of security that are required with handling of each one, different implications for trade treaties, for example, because countries basically import and export drugs as well. So it was as much for the emerging global pharmaceutical industry as it was for the drug war, but they both kind of went together.
Yeah, awesome. And very interesting. And also, just like talking about that, like, how do you feel that the federal prohibition has been like impacting like our current like modern day society and like legal framework for cannabis, especially? Like, how do you think it's been impacting that?
Well, it's the basis for it, right? And to be clear, this is a shift in bases from the 1937 Marijuana Tax Stamp Act. That was a different thing. So that was a prohibition that was really based upon revenue. It was basically like, you haven't paid the special tax to be eligible to work with cannabis, and so we're going to nail you, right? And so even if you have a joint, like, there's draconian penalties, but the penalties are based on essentially depriving the federal government of revenue. Basically, that law was thrown out in 68, 69 with Leary v. United States. The Supreme Court, basically, decision that overturned the 1937 Act. And so briefly, what we had was cannabis was not federally illegal. It was still illegal because all the states had their own schedules and criminal sanctions around cannabis and other drugs as well. So our system is always, it's two-tiered. It's not just the feds, it's the states. And then sometimes localities too, with Washington, D.C. being a particularly interesting animal of its own, right? So what happened, after Leary v. United States, in the context of the U.S. having been party to and pushing the 1961 UN treaty that was also about regulating pharmaceuticals around the world, and then incidentally also, banning, cannabis and some other drug plants. There was also the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances that was really geared towards the existing pharmaceutical industries in Europe and the United States. So there were a lot of reasons why they would create a Controlled Substances Act in 1970 and 1971. But certainly how cannabis was placed in Schedule I was, entirely political. It wasn't based upon science, and in fact, it went against the recommendations of the scientific team that was convened by Richard Nixon to study the problem and make a recommendation.
Yeah.
And so it was placed provisionally on Schedule I, where it's still technically provisionally on Schedule I, but the provision was, pending the outcome of the Schaefer Commission, which the outcome happened. They made their recommendation to decriminalize cannabis, and no action was taken.
Dr. Corva, can you describe what post-prohibition means?
So post-prohibition for me is as a way to understand what we're dealing with today, that is about the context we're working with, not necessarily the today part, although you can call it like an era or a time. Post-prohibition is simply the condition of having legalization with, not after prohibition. So we've actually had that since, 1976, when Robert Randall, his lawsuit got the federal government to stand up on the Compassionate Investigative New Drug Act, which had the University of Mississippi sending 300 joints a month to Robert Randall and a bunch of other people for the rest of their lives. Right? The program was closed down in the early 90s, but that was legal cannabis, federally legal cannabis going to Robert Randall in 1976. But there was prohibition all around it.
Right.
It was like an exception that got carved out from it. And so really, since then, of course, in the mid 80s, Marinol was invented, a synthetic delta-9 THC as a legal medication that could be prescribed. So there's all this, in practice, we've had legalization all along, but we have never had like states roll out essentially frameworks for implementing a legal market that's regulated, right? And so the problem also is not just that, oh yes, we still have federal prohibition. That's kind of the easy way to understand post-prohibition is, of course, there's legalization in California, but we still have federal prohibition, so it affects how our legalization rolls out. The other problem is within California, we have massive amounts of prohibition. More than half the state has, because of local control, they do not implement legal cannabis. It is still banned. And so basically we have prohibition within legalized states as well. And that's just when we're talking about statutes. So the easiest way to understand prohibition is to understand that we are living in a situation that is not one thing or the other. It is both, and it's complex in different places in different ways.
Confusing.
Yes, confusing. So I do have people still that use post-prohibition to talk about like the era, right? And I always ask them, okay, well, but when are you talking about? Just be clear about it. Define your terms.
It's a big time.
Yeah. And so, often they'll say, well, 2012 when Washington, Colorado legalized cannabis. It's like, okay, that can work. But it is going to be different in different places. I mean, we had legalization in Uruguay in 2013, Canada in 2016. Germany just passed a form of legalization. Malta just passed a form of legalization. So that it's not just the time, it's the place that matters. And so I don't want to confuse people or make them angry because I'm using a post term. Post is with, not after.
Yeah.
And that's the clarification to make.
Just a quick question about like I feel like it's kind of a broad question that we can all kind of talk about because we're all kind of involved in it, but how kind of like federal prohibition like sets up like the small business cannabis industry and medical industry and environment, especially for like failure and like immediate like harm through like giant obstacles and barriers. Like how do we like how do we feel it?
Yeah.
Set it up for that.
Well, I love the question. There's a lot to talk about that. But let me ask actually, I want to ask you guys, when you started this program, did you realize it was that messed up?
No.
So it's not like immediately apparent to like the consumers out there, right? Especially ones that live in places that have implemented legal cannabis. There's stores. What's the problem, right? But certainly what we have is a supply chain that is just bottlenecked in a number of different directions because of post-prohibition, because we have 60% of the state's jurisdictions that don't allow cannabis, especially in urban jurisdictions where like we used to have tons of medical cannabis dispensaries serving a bunch of people. Now we just have a few retail stores. And so product can't get to shelves, and that's what I call the retail bottleneck. That's not just in banned counties. It's very important to understand in places like Los Angeles, which the percentage of the actual retail spots they have there that are legal is actually kind of low. Like there's plenty of unregulated retail spots. And to me, basically that means there's demand for it, but we can't somehow, accommodate these retail shops in the landscape, right? Like we can't let them transition. It's not easy enough. There's too many regulations. The zoning is really bad. And so like that also creates the retail bottleneck too. It's like if people don't have access nearby to choose regulated cannabis, they're not going to choose it.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that hard. So there is, I think a lot of confusion about this and the failure of legal cannabis. Well, the failure of legal cannabis is that it has not, in fact, it has failed to overturn prohibition, right? Like that's the failure of legal, that's the source of it. Mm-hmm. Having regulations that make sense is another layer on it. There's, the tax question, which is, certainly, taxes are too high, so the product is too expensive. So access isn't just geographic, it's price. Mm-hmm. And so, especially for, I think, medical patients and daily users, like prices definitely add up. And so like, they're not going to choose legal cannabis, right? Like the price point doesn't make any sense. And it's not because of the cost of production. It is all this friction in the supply chain and then taxes and so forth. But the tax question itself is I think, I don't want to make people mad, but I think it might be a little overblown because Washington State has an effective 45% tax rate like the entire time. And like, they don't have the kinds of issues we have in California. It's where the taxes are, where they're collected, and generally like collect them at retail at the endpoint, right? Is the main goal. The taxes are too high. I don't want to flip it, but on the other hand, like there are other states that don't seem to have the same, issues, including price point, with higher tax rates. Yeah, because a high tax on a low price is not that much.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is cannabis regulated like closer to a nuclear waste product instead of any other agricultural crop?
Well, because of prohibition, right? But that's the easy answer. Let me actually be more specific. What this is it's a vice tax, right? So a vice tax is a way to use the tax system to kind of regulate people's like purchasing choices and power. And we have this in, we have it on cigarettes, we have it on wine, we have it on all these other things. But there are stakeholders, obviously, who, stakeholders from legalization means something quite different from ending prohibition. And I would say the public health and prevention community is kind of the big one, even though people actually talk about law enforcement. It's the public health and prevention community that is, particularly concerned about the externalized costs of weed consumption. The issue, I think, in terms of the perspective, they're rightly concerned about like, okay, now marketing and advertising comes into the picture. And marketing and advertising is an issue in society. We are sold a lot of things that are bad for us. And a lot of things that are bad for kids are advertised to kids. And like they're on firm ground when they're talking about that. The issue really is, what are the substitutes and what is the existing use situation? Because if you're restricting legal cannabis, as it turns out, people can go ahead and access the markets they've been accessing all along. So focusing on all these restrictions for legal cannabis actually, it harms them, right? They're shooting themselves in the foot. They're not preventing more use. They're just moving use to the unregulated side of things, which is less of an issue for the plant and the plant products to me, which are, by nature far lower in THC, don't have additives and stuff. There's the concern about pesticides and so forth, but It's a simpler, weaker product that if people don't have access to that, now they're buying, synthetic products. Now they're choosing, concentrates. And concentrates, there's a, global history of concentrate consumption in hash, right? But, at the same time, when you concentrate something, you are concentrating all the other things that go along with it, including when you're making it. And so the potential for there to be unhealthy things in it is higher.
Mm-hmm.
It could use some more regulation. And when you don't let people access the regulated, tested product, they're going to go get it on the unregulated side of things. And now, what does that even mean, the unregulated side of things now? Because it's actually a number of different things. These days, because of the Farm Bill, it includes THCA hemp.
Mm-hmm. Which is what?
Which is weed. It's completely unregulated, and I'm not all that worried about that. There's ways in which I'm kind of like, oh yeah, that was clever. But it is weed with a COA, a lab test on it that says there's less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC in this product. And the plant, when it's harvested and dried, actually is mostly THCA. It's when you heat it, i.e. when you apply heat to it, that the THC is converted to Delta-9 THC.
Mm-hmm.
The THCA is converted to Delta-9 THC. Let me be clear. And so regular weed that we know is weed in a bag is mostly THCA. That's true. There is a percentage of it that is Delta-9 THC already, though. There is some of that. And the thing that people don't really get is that every last one of these THCA, unregulated products, which has a COA on it to say we're legal, we're Farm Bill hemp, those lab results are all fudged. Mm-hmm. Because you actually never have Delta-9 THC that's under 0.3% in regular weed. You can look at any of your regular tested products. We had this discussion yesterday, actually, at Crisp, and people were like, "Oh, what? Maybe it automatically has less than 0.3." There's a COA right there. Look on it. Look at how much Delta-9 THC is in your blueberry muffin joint, and it was 1.5%.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's two things going on here. One is a clever kind of redefinition, but it's also based upon the participation of labs that are completely making these numbers up.
Yeah, it's not real evidence.
It's not. And so at the same time, of course, in the American South, what's happened is these states are basically proceeding to go ahead and set up, they're legalizing THCA weed. Mm-hmm. With much lower taxes and whatever else. And their people are getting used to that. So what happens when, they decide to say, oh, no, actually, we're going to try to be like California. If you're Tennessee, you're like, no, we hate California anyway. Mm-hmm. And you guys are stupid. Your market is messed up. And we're going to just stick with what we're doing. Even though we're the place that hates weed more than you. So there's a very weird thing going on here. Yeah.
That's super good.
Yeah.
How did hard enforcement of prohibition change the genetics that were grown?
We need Caleb in here for this as well. But yes, how did it change the genetics? So hard prohibition, oh God. Let's call hard prohibition the situation where, there is active enforcement against cultivation. And so the first thing, of course, is that it actually happened internationally first in terms of the large-scale spraying of crops and so forth. And so the stuff that we were importing here in the United States, the genetics, which were coming from around the world, they were coming from Mexico, they were coming from Colombia, they were coming from Thailand, they were coming from Hawaii, which was not international, but it was the Thai stuff was coming from India, maybe a little less so, South Africa, Africa. So there was, a flow of genetics to the United States that certain aficionados basically were picking out seeds from it, right? Mm. And they were growing them in their backyard, right? And depending on how much their backyard looked like the place where this seed actually came from, like they grew better or not, right? If their backyard mimicked conditions in certain parts of Mexico, as you would have down in San Diego, like, yeah, grew really well, right? Depending on the microclimate and elevation and so forth, like, the Afghani stuff did really well out here in Humboldt as opposed to other places. So the process of basically of hybridizing these genetics, like in the first instance, it's like you mix something from Colombia with something from Pakistan, you get massive hybrid vigor because the genetic pools were so distinct. It's like the further away they are, then you get like actually some pretty cool stuff. And then you keep doing that. But if you're not going back to and reintroducing, new kinds of genetics that are distinct genetically, if you just keep inbreeding, basically, then you start to develop a lack of genetic diversity, basically.
Sterility.
Yep, sterility. And so, what did hard prohibition have to do with that necessarily? Well, a lot of that was the outcome of breeders going to places where actually there wasn't hard prohibition. So they were hanging out in Santa Cruz, like Rob Clark and so forth, playing around with genetics. And then here comes the 1980s. And it gets really hard to breed, and especially breed in a way that like was somewhat casual because like you just threw it outside and you weren't playing around with it that much. You didn't have necessarily dedicated labs set up and so forth. You
Natural breeding.
Yeah, it was natural breeding, right? So they're happening kind of slowly and not really messing with the gene pool too much at all. So then basically like they go to Amsterdam, right? And in Amsterdam, then they become serious breeders, right? So so they start to develop, and now they're breeding indoor as well, right? So they start developing stuff that ends up getting, re-exported in terms of seeds to the United States. So that's one example of what happens is people are, doing natural breeding outside and whatever, and then now you put them in a situation where they become specialists. Then you have, the situation like in Humboldt with camp in the 80s, where actually the helicopters would wipe out whole, whatever someone was breeding in that particular microclimate, it'd just be lost, right? And that's happened all the way to the present day. But I mean, I was hearing of important genetics being lost, as recently as like 2016, 2017. A lot of the CBD genetics actually that Ringo been playing around with. There was a library getting stored in particular spots, and like both spots got popped, and so boom, all that's gone, right? So there is a way in which like hard prohibition has a direct like removal of genetics from what's out there.
Yeah.
And then it also kind of channels things into particular situations that, don't lend themselves to necessarily, diversifying what's going on. And then there's just kind of the general kind of like, well, if we want to do hybrid vigor and we want to grab stuff from around the world, but actually like there's there's hard enforcement in a number of different places. You just don't have that freedom to do that.
Yeah.
No.
Exactly.
I know that hard prohibition really forced out a lot of those musky or skunky terpenoid profiles.
That's the answer. That's the better answer.
Because these growers and breeders were pushed indoors and didn't want to
The smell.
right. They wanted to
Yeah.
have a
The smell.
those sweeter, fruitier smells really started to be.
Yeah.
Such a tragedy. I think people are trying to backtrack now.
Oh, there was a film in the late 90s or early 2000s. I can't remember the name of it, in which it's kind of a road trip film. Like Breckenmeyer is in it. A couple of people that got famous later, but like one of the people in the road trip crew, he was kind of like a science nerd basically, but loved weed. And the credit rolling, like whatever happened to these people afterward, right, was that he invented a cultivar they called a strain that had no smell whatsoever. And so like basically like you couldn't get caught if you
That is insane.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is of course
Ultimate.
example of what, an example of what Kane's talking about here. But of course, like we don't want that. We want the smell.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's really
You want the stink. Yeah, it's important to it. I feel like lately, like with all most of the cultivars I've been getting from like the dispensaries, at least nearby here, are kind of just they're all like the same. Like I don't really notice any muskiness. Like I don't know any like skunk type profiles. Like I've only kind of seen like lemon, zesty, like limonene type things. But like I don't know. I don't know like where
The genetic pool is so oversaturated. If you think about like if you were to add a bunch of colors together, and then you're just gonna get brown.
Yeah, exactly.
Gray,
yeah,
just bush, right? And that's what's happening with all these crazy poly hybrids when we just
oversaturation. Yeah,
we just end up with one smell, one effect. It's pretty crazy.
And
it's
so,
said,
like,
Caden.
it's so just like sad and also like ironic too, though. It's like in that like because it's beautiful to like breed and to search for those like crosses and to like the stories that I've heard about, especially regarding like Ringo and like people searching for specific like effects and profiles. It's a really beautiful thing, but to see how that has inadvertently like stabbed us in the back and led to the opposite of what people are looking for is really ironic and sad.
Absolutely. There is also the marketing and popularity of very particular things like the cookies crosses.
Yeah, of course.
It's like they're in everything.
I feel like it's just like a large ag, like capitalist, like
monoculture.
Yeah, monoculture.
Yeah.
Oh, that California.
Lack of biodiversity, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, Eleanor Kuntz with LeafWorks, who's in the Legacy Genetics grant and does a lot of the genomic stuff, is definitely geographically there's less diversity in Southern California than there is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how can we all, as members of the humble cannabis community, support things like small businesses, medical cannabis research, and environmental protection as a way to maintain our community and maintain the belief that cannabis should be fully legal?
Wow. Okay. So there's definitions necessary each step of the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is a community, right? What is the humble cannabis community? And I think, one of the things, because we need to understand like what is the community we're talking about and how it's like different within it in order to understand it collectively, right? Because you do even here have, different people with different interests. And I think, one of the things that Measure A, sort of showed us was a very big difference of opinion from certain people who were absolutely part of the humble cannabis community back in the day, and a difference of opinion about like what legal cannabis means and who legal cannabis cultivators are and whether they are actually people they want in their community. And so, the event had Betsy and Mark, and I'm gonna say kind of no comment around Mark. I don't know what his relationship with the plan is. I know Betsy, was very, very open as someone that like was a medical cannabis, activist.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had the guy that actually went around writing scripts for everybody. So the doctor that made a bunch of money,
Mm-hmm.
basically, helping people grow as much as possible, right, and have access to weed. And so there's medical cannabis, but also he was commercially involved as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, all these people basically deciding, like we know better than everyone else how things should go. So there's divisions within the community, and a lot of that is kind of based upon, the environmental situation that was a result of the green rush,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this is the thing to kind of think about. And I think it's going to be working on it for a while, but for about, between 1996 and 2010, the medical cannabis activists, the people in the watersheds, the urban people, the grow houses, like they weren't pointing fingers at each other. They were, occasionally saying some things about, the diesel dope spill here or whatever else, or like I don't like those
Diesel.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. So that's off grid indoor production required diesel fuel, and like sometimes there would be a spill into creeks, which is environmental damage.
Yeah.
There was a general kind of like, if you were in one watershed, like you don't know what's going on in another watershed. You don't really have a direct line of sight into like, some of the really egregious, like, grading and, just massively impactful environmental stuff. So you would have people like continuing as usual. Maybe they've scaled up a bit, but like they're generally like individually at their own site, not obvious to them, contributing to the, water problem. But their cumulative impacts all taken together were.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've never really reconciled, I think, as a whole, just kind of come to a sense that, like in Humboldt, the Humboldt cannabis community was doing a lot of things, and like whether we liked it or not, people who consider themselves part of the Humboldt cannabis community were doing some awful things. And some of them were doing some really good things too. Mm-hmm. Some of them were doing things that were immensely helpful. But they couldn't really necessarily see each other. Certainly weren't taking responsibility for each other. So like in this day and age, 2024, right? We're living with the fact that nobody ever really took responsibility for certain things, not collective responsibility. It was always, I'm not doing it. Right. And so, that may very well be true. And even your best regenerative cannabis farmer today, it's like, I'm not doing it for sure. But guess what? Like the policies that kind of came to you, they weren't aimed at you. They were aimed at some awful things going on around you that like were cannabis. And so like, how do you differentiate that? How do you actually reclaim your community as our community means this? Like that was not us.
Yeah. And
to be able to like act collectively to say our brand is not industrial agriculture. Like you have to be able to do that and to be able to like lobby the government to like be reasonable with you.
Right. Yeah.
Because like they had to, in the best case scenario, regulators and various environmental stakeholders that like lobbied for really strict environmental regulations, they had really good costs. And so most of that has gone away at this point. So who are they now? And that's kind of what the symposium was about as well. It was like, who are we now in the landscape? And so I think the first rule of defending your community is getting together and defining it with each other, and establishing a certain kind of just cultural accountability that is, beyond the regulations and the compliance and whatever else. It is a cultural identity that's like, we're about restoration. We're about regenerative practices. Yeah. We're about protecting our water. We're about respecting Native American lands. And that's our brand. I mean, our brand of weed is good for the earth. Mm-hmm. Our brand of community is regenerative community as well. Mm-hmm. Right? And so how can we support this? I think we need to support that kind of definition. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it for you. Yeah. And about you.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's what's been going on. And there's been so little of this kind of reconstructive, actually, no, we're not that, we're this, mm-hmm. right? So you could say we're not something. Yeah. As long as you want, but like, what are you? Yeah. And so being able to come together, it's very important to do that. I think it's, there are other ways to support that are an outcome about it, which is like, you want to buy from your Sun and Earth certified cultivators, right? Like if that's your Humboldt community, these people represent the best of it. Like, there you go. Yeah. You want to ask for outdoor. I went to the dispensary in Eureka. I won't name it, actually. I don't avoid that right now. But yeah. And I was like, my first question was like, what's local, right? And the bud tender was like, I don't know. And I'm like, and I'm like, what's sun grown? What's you got like Sun and Earth certified? It's like, I don't know what that is. And And like you got his manager. His manager was like a little more knowledgeable. You know, he was at least knew kind of what was local, but it was still kind of like, wow.
Let 18-year-olds be bud tenders.
Really?
Yeah. Like
knowledgeable.
It was, but it also goes to show that the people they're selling to actually are not sophisticated cannabis consumers, because otherwise they would know that and be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that tells you, well, who's patronizing legal retail, especially in Humboldt? Tourists, right? People new to the area, maybe, you know?
Students, maybe.
Yeah. And so, like, you know, when those stores don't know the community, the people who buy from them will never know the community. It's just like they're like in LA or something like that. So,
just to tell,
it's you know, it's asking the questions when you buy things that like help these stores realize maybe we should know about this stuff, you know, and strengthening these local supply chains. I mean, there's an extent to which there's some brand ambassadoring that's, you know, that could happen when you're not in Humboldt, you know, like asking at those stores. You know? There's some pretty cool stuff going on. That's not just Humboldt, but like equity branded supply chains that connects, you know, equity cultivators to equity distributors to equity retail people.
Whoa.
And cool. and that's some really cool stuff going on, actually connecting, you know, these legacy communities, which, like, I think for too long when we say legacy community, we talk about just sort of cultivators, but we don't talk about like urban legacy.
Yeah.
And I think that's been bad, because I think there's been no concerted effort to like transition, you know, the legacy, you know, urban actors like there has been for the rural actors, you know, just like, no, like you're not fit for consumption in terms of like, you know, sign up for this equity program. And if you partner with a rich white guy, you might be able to make it, you know, like, and that's no good. Yeah.
Very well said, Dr. Dominic Corva.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dominic, for all of your important insights. I think you're one of the most like informed person to be like pioneering this future cannabis studies lab and all the future things that we'll be doing in this area and space. And I really appreciate you for all of your comments today. And thank you, Kate and David, for being here as well.
Of course.
Thank you, Doctor.
This does not happen without you guys. You know, like having students like you is what makes it. Like, I couldn't do anything if I didn't have you guys. So thank you so much for being here and asking these questions and just being a part of this. You're creating it too. So thank you.
Of course.
Look at how far we've come too. We just started.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
It's only the beginning.
Yeah.
We got motion.
We do. Looking forward to the next few years with you guys, and then we'll be on that too. Awesome.
Hell yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Peace out.
Thank you for growing with Subsistence Crop, a podcast by the Cannabis Studies Lab at Cal Poly Humboldt.